Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Matt, for that introduction. I've been asked to talk to you this morning about soil carbon sequestration, and it's a bit of a daunting task. It's a hot topic at the moment, and it's a topic that I think you could describe as being subject to the robust discussion that Peter referred to. What I'm going to do today is try to rely on the evidence that we have from science past and for the trials that many of you have been involved in. But I'm going to start just with a little bit of context and a description of the terms that we're using, because I think this is part of the reason for the robust discussion. Now, I don't need to remind anyone here of the value of the rangelands. It's a little bit sensitive, I think. And especially after the very powerful welcome to country that we have. We're talking about a very vast area of land, one that is the home and provides the home and the livelihoods for millions of people, but is also of great social and cultural value. And it's very diverse. Now, all of these things come together to make it a very difficult area to work with. It's obviously sensitive to a lot of environmental issues too. But after the welcome to country, I also want to pay my respects to the Yawuru people, the traditional owners of this land on which we stand, and their elders past and present, and acknowledge the love and the care they have for the country. But despite this value, despite its long history, it's only quite recently that there's been a global focus in understanding the soils of the rangelands. There's been much more investment in more temperate and more productive lands, perhaps. And it's only in the last year or so that we've had a global soil organic carbon map developed for the rangelands, which I would like to show you, if I could. Okay, so I'm going to talk without the slides, but when they come back, you will see that in the rangelands, they cover globally under the definitions at the International Livestock Research Institute, they cover as much as 54% of land area, but really about 25% of the surface land-free area of the globe is used for grazing. And that land holds about 30% of the soil carbon globally. But if you look at the map that will come up eventually, you'll see that the amount of soil carbon per unit area is largely at the lower end of other lands. So we're starting from a baseline, and a natural baseline due to the low productivity that reflects aridity in many regions and unreliable rainfall and often poor nutrient soils. We're starting from a position of low soil organic carbon naturally. Even so, since the Paris Agreement, there's been a large increase in interest in the potential to increase the soil carbon. Even a small percentage increase per unit area multiplied by an area of 79.5 million square kilometres is going to be a large amount of carbon, and that has sparked interest and a lot of new interest in here. But the science is still emerging. The policy is emerging probably at a much greater rate even than the science. And the number of stakeholders across carbon market people and various land management people as well as NGOs has also expanded. So we have a sort of rather difficult environment in which to work. So I'll just keep talking. So that's the context that we have globally. In Australia, the rangelands cover a large percentage of our land area. but there's soils that are largely poor in soil carbon. They have low organic matter, and that reflects something that I'll talk about a little bit later, but hangs on the primary productivity. Understanding that soil carbon comes initially from plant growth. If you don't have plant growth, the soil carbon can't increase. And most lands within the rangelands have less than 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare, and many are less than 20 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So we want to understand how soil carbon can be sequestered, and to do that, we have to speak about some terms that we're going to use quite often, but I think different interpretations and different uses of the terms are part of the reason for the robust discussions. So soil, it contains carbon in two forms, organic and inorganic, and I apologise, this is pretty basic, but unless we're talking about the same thing, we're not going to make a lot of progress. So when we talk about soil carbon sequestration, we focus on the organic carbon portion of that carbon because that's the part that responds to management, and that's the part that we're very interested in increasing, or to understand whether we can increase by a change in management. Sorry, I'm still looking for slides. So carbon enters the soil as a result of photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, converting it into plant material, plant residues and root material, root exudates, and microbial populations that get their energy from that plant material being incorporated in the soil. Now, soil organic carbon is that portion that's less than 2 millimetres inside. So plant litter and bits of root, for instance, that are greater than 2 millimetres shouldn't be counted as soil carbon. The soil carbon, once it enters the soil, is decomposed by microbes, and in the process of respiration, much of that carbon in organic matter is returned to the atmosphere. So it returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide, and in a stable community, they're fairly much in balance. The carbon that's going in through carbon dioxide and going out through respiration is fairly much in balance, and you get a sort of threshold of soil carbon level. But some of it, a small proportion, becomes stabilised. The fast cycling part is lost within days to decades, but a small proportion can, through chemical and physical transformations, be protected from further breakdown and held in the soil for periods of centuries, even thousands of years. And that part represents a net removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and therefore contributes to climate change mitigation or carbon dioxide sequestration. And that's the part that's receiving all the attention at the moment. So we need to understand how we can keep putting organic matter into the soil, organic carbon, and I'll just make it clear, organic matter is about 58% carbon, and that's the part that we're talking about. So we want to know how we can increase the amount of carbon going into the soil, but also increase the amount that's stabilised. And it's not easy. It's not easy to measure that, because ultimately what we're looking at is a small change against a much larger background and a very variable soil and spatially diverse environment, and one that's also temporally diverse, because it depends on plant growth, and we all know how variable our rangeland climates are. So I'm just going to go through this just to catch up. Okay, so this is the global soil map, and you can see if my face wasn't in the way, that Australia has the light colours there, Northern Africa, and many of the rangelands of the world have those light colours that signify low soil carbon. The Australian rangelands, and I've taken a fairly broad definition. The boundaries aren't critical, but they are areas that are that is the primary production in those lands is grazing livestock, and that they haven't been subjected to intense modification and intense agriculture. And this is the soil organic carbon map of Australia that was developed from a large investment in sampling by the government, the federal government, and you can see that the lighter colour there, less than up to 30, largely tonnes per hectare, but up to 40 in the savannas, is low relative to the coastal arable regions. Whoops. Okay. This is, yeah. Okay, I think I've got, I skipped this one because I didn't have the prompt of the slides, but I wanted to just say about the growth in interest in soil carbon sequestration projects in Australia. And as you know, Australia counts soil carbon sequestration towards its targets for the Paris Agreement. It has a strong interest in understanding how we can increase soil carbon, and it has promoted soil carbon projects through a carbon crediting scheme that you probably have seen referred to as the Emission Reduction Fund, called Carbon Farming. I think it's now changed its name to be called the ACU, Australian Carbon Credit Unit Scheme. But what this shows is that while the method was first available as far past as 2014, the growth was initially small in the amount of projects that were being registered, but it has grown just about exponentially. And the 45 for 2023 is an interim number up until about July. But there's currently 470 projects registered. It's the fastest growing across all sectors. And there's recently been a large issue of ACCUs made. There were very few, less than 2,000, up until 2020, or up until 2022. But there's recently been a big increase, and I'm happy to talk to someone later about that. It takes a bit of explaining about why there was a slow uptake, but it's up and away now. And just for interest, this is where the projects are. There's various methods listed down the bottom that give you the colours. This is where projects have been registered, and I've just tried to highlight there the Queensland area that show exactly where they are. As you can see, there aren't any yet in these northern areas, but nevertheless, there are projects in the rangelands, and we need to be aware of how we can manage the interest and any potential risks, as well as promote any opportunities. So that's what I'm talking about today. And this is what I was discussing in the way soil carbon enters the soil, and the complexity of what soil carbon is. That it is not a single homogeneous substance. It exists in a number of forms that remain in the soil for a range of times. And soil carbon sequestration is a okay. It's a small part of, it's slow to respond, and Okay. So the amount that's sequestered is a small part of the total soil carbon, and I won't go through that explanation because I'm going to run out of time again, but again, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. The other point I really would like to make here is that both the fast cycling and the slow cycling carbon pools are important for production in the rangelands. We focus for climate change reasons, for carbon crediting reasons, on sequestered soil carbon. But the fast cycling pool is absolutely fundamental for productivity. And building soil organic matter, soil organic carbon, is critical for maintaining soil health and for production. And in some ways they're complementary. The persistent or slow cycling portion provides some benefits, not only soil carbon sequestration, but in terms of water storage and nutrient immobilisation. It's positive in that way, although nutrient immobilisation, depending on your circumstances, can be detrimental to growth. But the rapid turnover pool, as the organic matter breaks down, releases the nutrients that are needed for growth. Now, this is pretty basic, and the great majority of you will be well on top of that, but it's just the context in which we look at what we're trying to do to manage for soil organic carbon sequestration. Okay. So going back to this map about the low soil carbon, does a low soil organic carbon mean that there's potential to build it up to the high levels of 200 tonnes of carbon per hectare that you might see around the coast? Well, the answer is probably not always, and the reason for that is that the amount of carbon in soil is largely controlled by rainfall, by temperature, by the soil properties, and particularly by the amount of clay in soil, and then by land use. So cropping, for instance, disturbs the soil, exposes organic matter to break down, and often, or almost always, leads to a decline in soil carbon. So these are four parameters, four factors that are important in determining the amount of organic matter that goes in and is lost. But does that mean management doesn't have a chance? And the answer is probably no. But if you integrate those there are possibilities for management, but the net primary productivity is an integration of what happens, and we have to look at that to understand how much organic matter goes in. Unless we get additions and control what happens, we're not going to sequester carbon, and that's the reality. But how much is possible is... sorry, this is very jumpy. Is a question, how much impact can we make with management? There was a survey done by Rabbi et al. And published in 2015 along the eastern states. So it's not all rangelands. And the findings for each state are fairly similar. So what I've done here is just show the Queensland results. And they use a standardised effect on soil carbon stock of 7 or 8 key drivers of organic matter. So latitude, and that relates a lot to temperature. So elevation, aridity, slope, clay, and then 3 that relate to management: pasture types, residue, and land uses. The greatest effect is aridity, which is a combination of rainfall and temperature factors. And the second on that, in terms of ranking, is clay. Now, it's the clay content of the soil that largely provides the ability for organic carbon to be protected from microbial breakdown. So it's a factor that's most important in stabilisation. And when you look at this, you can see that the three factors on your right-hand side that have the smallest effect. So management can have an effect, but it is small and constrained by the drivers of climate and soil factors and landscape factors. And particularly rainfall, which has been shown in some circumstances to control as much as 90% of the difference. So these are important, but that's what we're looking at when we talk about changing management to increase soil carbon. So can we increase soil organic carbon? So it's a question that we looked at in a review of the Northern Australian rangelands, and DAF funded this review. It looked at all the papers that had data on soil carbon, and only about 60 of those papers had suitable data for looking at soil organic carbon because of the measurement requirements that are set out in international standards of having to measure soil organic carbon stocks. The percent carbon in the top 10 centimetres does not tell you whether you're sequestering carbon. And we collated the data under 3 management types: grazing management strategies, pasture management, and land conversion strategies. So what this review found was that there were some opportunities, but there was a lot of inconsistencies in the results, and none of the trends were actually significant based on the few data that we have. So sowing forage legumes or more productive grasses increased soil carbon consistently by about 0.1 to 0.3 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. Prolonged high stocking rates almost always led to a lower soil organic carbon level compared to conservative stocking. Grazing management strategies such as rotational grazing or intensive time control grazing, we could find no consistent or no significant effect in the published research and the previous trials. Sequestration was more consistent when you started from a degraded baseline. So if you'd lost soil carbon through overgrazing or other reasons, you were more likely to be able to increase. There were significant co-benefits for water holding capacity, resilience to drought, etc., associated with many of the practices that were implemented really to increase soil carbon. But trade-offs are possible. Trade-offs in terms of costs and in terms of loss of flexibility in management. So I won't go through that. In any more detail, but the overarching observations were that there are a few long-term studies in the rangelands that have high-quality data on sequestration. Studies had marked differences in design, in measurements, and in implementation of practices that made it difficult to draw any conclusions. And as a result, there were inconsistencies in results between studies. And that increases the uncertainty in what is achievable. If you compare the results that we had in that review for the Northern Rangelands, they're broadly consistent with other reviews. And I've put references to just 3 there, but there's a whole body of information. That opportunities are likely to be modest. We need more long-term studies, and the long-term stability or permanence of the sequestration of carbon, even when it's been measured over a couple of decades, is unknown. And I'm just going to touch on that because I think it's a critical issue in terms of the risks component of my title. This study refers to one at Condobolin led by Warwick Badgery, and it shows the change in soil carbon. Now, it is only in the top 10 centimetres, but it's indicative of other work that shows deeper trends. And there's 4 treatments, but it doesn't matter. The trends are the same. And the red ones noted are for perennial pastures. And you can see in this study, they increased for 12 years, but then in 3 years when the rainfall was less and nutrients were probably run down, you lost it all. There was no change in management that led to that loss. And I think that's something we have to be aware of. And climate change is an even bigger problem, I think, coming up. This was a study done for the government, and it shows that of all the ERF methodologies, of all the carbon farming methods out there, soil carbon projects were most susceptible to changes in climate, to warming and to unreliable rainfall. And that's because that affects both accumulation of carbon and the propensity to lose it. So what I'm going to do is just skip through the realities and the risks. We need more long-term trials. We need to be able to assess the co-benefits and the trade-offs, because that is what determines whether producers in the rangelands are going to take up changes in management. We need accurate, cost-effective measurement methods. That's a major stumbling block to participation in possible rewards from soil carbon, and we need accessible databases so that we can share knowledge. And we need some risk assessment tools and independent information and advisory services on carbon credit opportunities. I've run out of time, so I'm not going to talk to this slide, but it just shows the variability in rangelands, and I have to thank everyone that contributed to the sort of work I've been talking about. Thank you.
Beverly, I apologise for the IT difficulties, but thanks for pushing through it. I really appreciate you just kept going. Thank you. One of the benefits of a face-to-face conference is the opportunity to talk between sessions, breakfast, over dinner with many of the different presenters. So I'm pleased to let everybody know that Beverly's going to be with us for the duration of the conference, and I encourage you to talk to Beverly, especially about all things carbon. I just don't think we got the full picture there of what Beverly's capable and knows. So I really encourage people to take the opportunity and catch up with Beverly throughout the conference. Thank you. We are running on time, but we've got time for one quick question. So, Rosie's first hand up.
Hi Beverly, thanks very much for the presentation. I just had a question about soil organic carbon within HIR areas. So obviously we know that aridity and soil, like the clay content, can impact on the soil organic carbon, and we can lose the soil organic carbon pretty easily, and water has a big effect. But I'm just wondering, and I've heard there's the potential when you're doing vegetation-based projects, that there's a potential to do soil carbon within these areas. And I just wanted to hear if you have any evidence or you've seen any ability to hold that soil organic carbon, because the loss of that soil organic carbon would impact the project and make it unviable, obviously because of the cost of setup and sampling and all of those.
Look, that's an excellent question, and it's quite complex actually. There is a method being developed that will, whether it actually gets written into law is another question, and we're not up to that stage, but there is a method being developed that allows you to have both soil carbon projects and vegetation projects on the same piece of land. The evidence that we looked at earlier showed that there was little evidence for an increase in soil carbon under trees unless you were starting from a degraded baseline. and we really don't have the long-term data to understand whether it's going to be persistent or likely to be lost. When the vegetation method was made, soil carbon wasn't included because of the uncertainty and because of the need to be conservative in what credits were given for. So I can't fully answer your question, but I'll have a chat later.
Because so many hands went up when we asked a question, we'll take one more, but please keep the question quick, please.
Thanks for that presentation, Beverly. Blythe Cowden speaking. I was just curious as to whether the management on the 2 properties were issued the 150,000 carbon credits this year were assessed as part of that management affecting sequestration rates.
The review that was referred to for Northern Grayslands was completed before that issuance, and it looked at literature that was published or incredible reports that were online, so that those results weren't out in time. And I think it's important that we do have more transparency in projects so that they can be assessed readily and that data brought together so we all can build some better understanding of what's happening. Until we have the data and understand how it was measured and what the numbers were and how the modelling was done, it's really difficult to comment.